Good afternoon, class. Sorry about today. Um, just to keep it brief, my grandfather is a kidney transplant patient and his kidneys aren't doing too well right now. So I had to take him to the hospital last night and stayed with him until he got admitted, which took some time. I got back really late and, thought it was appropriate to cancel class for the day. But, here's the lecture and, just keep them in your thoughts and prayers, please. And I appreciate that. So for today's lecture, I'm going to be talking about the remaining macromolecules, the proteins and lipids. And I'm going to talk about how some of these manifest into cardiovascular disease. So let's just get started. So for today's outline, I'm going to give you a brief overview of proteins. You've seen them before. And I'll talk about, the different compositions of them. And then, oops, I have an error here, emphasis on fiber, my mistake. Wrong lecture. Now I'm going to talk about how proteins are absorbed, and I'm going to highlight some key amino acids that I think are pretty important to be aware of. And then I'm going to talk about lipids and the different kinds that exist. And I'm really going to emphasize the good kinds of fats that exist and explain to you why they're good. I'll talk about how these lipids are absorbed and how high amounts of lipids could lead to cardiovascular disease. So for these learning objectives, like always, if you know what they are, you're going to do fine on the exam. So just understand the different types of names that exist for both proteins and lipids. Understand the basic process of how proteins and lipids are absorbed in the body, and be aware of some of the enzymes that are involved in that. Know the different types of lipids and how they differ from one another, because there's going to be a few different ones that I go over. So it'd be a good idea to, understand the key structural differences between them. And then I want you to understand what hyperlipidemia is and how that could lead to cardiovascular disease. So let's start with proteins. So proteins are made up of amino acids. So we learned about this in the central dogma of central biology. And, we're going to go ahead and reiterate some of that because instead of, being synthesized by the body, we're going to be talking about how we are able to consume proteins and how that is used by the body. So the basic unit of any protein is an amino acid. And so amino acids connected together are going to be called polypeptides. And so once a lot of these polypeptides are combined together, then that's going to be your protein. And so here I have example of the monomers, the amino acids. And so every amino acid is basically going to have this conserved structure. So it's going to have an amino group where it gets the same amino or amine. And then you're going to have this carboxylic acid group where you get the acids part of the amino acids. It's all going to be connected through this carbon, and there's going to be a hydrogen attached to it. And then what makes every single amino acid different is going to be this side group. And so I'll show you in a couple of slides what some examples of these side groups are, but every side group is going to have a different structure that's going to make every amino acid unique. Now, in order to combine amino acids and form this peptide bond, there's a dehydration reaction that needs to occur, basically where water ends up leaving or H2O molecules from these two different amino acids, and it's going to form your polypeptide. And this is going to be the same kind of bond that's used to join all amino acids. Now, when we're looking at the levels of amino acids, typically you'll see that there's 4 different levels, and it's just, all dependent on what level you're looking at. So when we start with the primary structure, that's just going to be the string of amino acids together. So here, we see this nice string, and think of these basic units as just letters of the alphabet. Now, when we look at the secondary structure, these are going to be how these amino acids interact with its neighbors. And so when you do that, basically, depending on what charge it is, it's either going to repel or attract. If they're opposite, attract. If they're the same, then they're going to repel. But think of the secondary structure analogous to words that are being made up from these letters. Now, when we look at the tertiary structure, this is going to be how the polypeptide or protein folds on itself. And this is all going to be dependent on, how the amino acids from the secondary structure are interacting with the different layers that are present. And so a lot of the time, because these proteins are going to be within our body and our body is mainly composed of water, um, the hydrophobic amino acids are going to be more on the inside of the protein, whereas the hydrophilic or water-loving amino acids are going to be more on the outside. And then the last level, the quaternary structure, is going to be how proteins basically interact and bind to one another. And this can be analogous to paragraphs. So here's a list of the 20 essential amino acids, or not essential, the 20 amino acids that are required by our body. And of course, I'm not going to have you memorize any of this, but just be familiar with that there's different kinds of amino acids that exist. And these are all, going to be dependent on the structure and the charge and whatnot. So when we look at these 20 amino acids, they're basically divided into 3 different categories. So there's going to be essential amino acids that basically they're essential because they cannot be synthesized by our own body, so we need to eat them. Whereas non-essential amino acids are amino acids that our own body can synthesize through some kind of biochemical mechanism. Now, conditional non-essential amino acids, they're ones that your body typically doesn't need, but if your body is in some kind of disease state, and this is typically going to be some kind of metabolic disorder, then you're going to need to consume some of these. And one of the prime examples of this kind of conditional non-essential amino acid is going to be tyrosine. So in some individuals, they have mutations in one of their enzymes called phenylalanine hydroxylase. And so when they're lacking this enzyme, basically the body can't convert phenylalanine, which is essential that we need. It can't convert it to tyrosine. So typically the body is fine without tyrosine because it can, make it through this biochemical pathway. But if you're missing that enzyme, it doesn't work. So you need to actually consume this in your diet. I'm not going to go through all the amino acids. There's just too many to go through. But I do want to highlight a couple of them that I think are pretty relevant to everybody. The main one I want to highlight, and I would like you to be aware of this one because you probably are going to be tested on, is tryptophan. So tryptophan is an essential amino acid. And again, anything that's essential means that the body cannot make it, so it needs to consume it. And so when we look at the structure of tryptophan, basically its main structure is going to be used to synthesize the feel-good neurotransmitter serotonin, which you can see here. So we can see the conserved regions of the molecule and then things that have changed. And then serotonin is usually associated with sleep. And so the reason for that is because it's a precursor to make the sleeping time molecule melatonin. And so for people that are depressed, there's usually an association with low levels of tryptophan. And so make sure you're eating good dietary sources that are high in tryptophan, such as bananas, salmon, and eggs. And then just, another note, tryptophan is also a precursor to make vitamin B3, which I'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow. And the other name for B3 is niacin. So where are my bodybuilders at? I know you guys always take this stuff. So branched-chain amino acids. So what are these? So branched-chain amino acids are also a type of an essential amino acid. And there's 3 of them in total, and they are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And so the reason why they're called branched-chain amino acids is because their functional group is branched. And so when I talked about that first slide, talking about proteins and amino acids, you basically have a carbon that has, the amino group and the carboxylic acid attached to it. And then you have some variable functional group that's attached to it. And in this case, these branched chains to this amino acid is what makes these BCAAs. And the reason why a lot of bodybuilders or people that are, trying to increase their muscle mass take these is because the muscles that we have in our body are basically 35% of these types of amino acids. So muscles in general are about 80% amino acids by weight. But when you're looking at the actual composition of the amino acids that make up those muscles, 35% of those are going to be these three main amino acids. So that's 1/3, that's pretty high. And then here we have a basic schematic of, you consume these branching amino acids, they go into the blood, and then they're used for muscle synthesis to go ahead and make the muscle. Now, if you're deficient in protein, or you're not exercising your muscles a whole lot, then your muscles are going to end up breaking down. And when they break down, they're basically going to go back to their monomer form amino acids so that they can be used for other biochemical processes. So how do we actually absorb some of this protein? And so I highlighted this when we're talking about the intro to macromolecules or nutrition. But let's go a little bit over it again. So for amino acid digestion, we're consuming whole protein. So our body needs to have these in the simplest form as possible in order to pass through the intestine. And so the first thing that's going to be done is by us chewing on the protein. And that's going to, break up the food as best as possible. And then it's going to go into the stomach. And so when it's in the stomach, you're going to have two different things that are going to help facilitate the breakdown of these proteins. You're going to have hydrochloric acid, which is going to denature the proteins or basically unfold them. And then you're going to have some kind of enzyme. And so the first enzyme these proteins encounter are pepsin. And pepsin is just going to fragment it into polypeptide chains. And so as the proteins continue through the gastrointestinal tract, it's going to finally make its way to the small intestine, where all the amino acids, once they're broken down, are going to be absorbed. And so you're going to have a bunch more type of enzymes that are going to facilitate this process. I highlighted them in a few lectures ago. So again, they're going to be trypsin, chymotrypsin, and other proteases. And these are going to break them down into, mono, di, and tripeptides. Once they're broken down into these small subunits, the intestine can absorb them, and they're going to absorb them similar to how we absorb carbs through some kind of transporter. And so these are going to be amino acid transporters that facilitate this. And there's tons of different kinds, and all of the transporters have an affinity for a specific size and charge of an amino acid. Basically, I'm not going to have you know all of those, but just be aware that in order for these amino acids to get into the body, they're facilitated through transporters. And so once the transporters facilitate the transport or import of the amino acids, depending on if they're already in the monomer form or if there's in the di or tri form, there's going to be other enzymes within the cell that are going to facilitate the breakdown. But once they're in the singular form, they're going to be deposited into the blood. So the rest of the body, such as your muscles, can go ahead and uptake this and use it for protein synthesis. So now we're going to go ahead and change gears a little bit and talk about lipids. So here's going to be a basic overview about lipids, and the majority of the lecture is going to be focused on lipids, as there's a lot of different classes and they all have their own different biological functions. So lipids are going to be a diverse group of organic compounds, and we usually refer to them as fats. But there's different kinds of fats, and again, they have all different kinds of functions. All lipids are going to be water-fearing or hydrophobic, so they do not mix with water. So there's going to be a whole process that needs to occur within our body in order to actually break up these these lipids, so we can go ahead and absorb them. So the main lipids that I'm going to be talking about in this lecture are going to be fatty acids, phospholipids, triglycerides, and cholesterol. And so note that these are all different. And so I have the three main ones that I'm highlighting here. And so every single one of these triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids, they're all going to have fatty acids attached to them. These fatty acids are what make them lipids. And because of what the fatty acids are attached to are going to change the class of the respective lipid. And so, fatty acids can be saturated, monounsaturated, or polyunsaturated, or can even form a ring, just like how we have here with cholesterol. I'm going to go ahead and emphasize what these are in a couple of slides, but just be aware that, you're going to hear some of these names. You see them on the back of food labels already, but it's a good idea to, be aware of be able to distinguish these, because you will end up getting tested on them. So what is their biological significance? So as I mentioned in one of the other lectures, fat is used as a fuel and has the highest amount of energy of any of the macromolecules, where it's 9 calories per gram. The main function that the fats are going to perform is insulation. And so this is going to be in our subcutaneous fat. We all have it. It's going to be under our skin, and it's just to keep us warm. Whereas we have another kind of fat, the visceral fat, which is going to act as a padding for our internal organs. And it's going to protect the internal organs as we move. But it is important to note that too much visceral fat, so this is the one that's surrounding all the organs, is not a good thing. Scientists now know that there's a lot of inflammation or inflammatory mediators that are occurring within this internal body. And we're still trying to figure out, what is some of this, but we have immune cells such as macrophages, which I'll talk about at the end of the class, that are basically trying to absorb some of this extra fat. And macrophages can a lot of the time they play a role in not only phagocytosis, but also producing pro-inflammatory cytokines. And so some of these fats are going to be stimulating the macrophage so they can go ahead and produce pro-inflammatory molecules. So this is not a good thing. The other significant biological effect that fats serve are going to be components of cell membranes. And so here you can see examples of cholesterol making up the cell membrane. And this is going to help facilitate fluidity of the cell when it's being able to move, so it makes it less rigid. And then the other main significance that fats serve are precursors for hormones. So here I have an example of cholesterol, and this basic structure is going to be used for the synthesis of a lot of different kinds of hormones, such as testosterone and estrogen, as well as some other kinds of steroids that facilitate stress, such as cortisol. So phospholipids, we basically are going to, I've already talked about these before in the first lecture. And so phospholipids are going to be really similar to triglycerides. So did I even highlight? Oops, I switched these. Oh, well. Basically with phospholipids, they're going to have a, phosphate head that's attached to a glycerol with 2 fatty acid tails attached to them. And when I talked about it in the first lecture, where they basically have a unique property, because most lipids are considered hydrophobic, but with these particular kinds of lipids, the tail is hydrophobic, but the head is hydrophilic. And so these phospholipids are basically going to be the main components of the plasma membrane as they're able to make that lipid bilayer, as you can see in this image here. And then so here's a nice structure highlighting the differences between phospholipids and triglycerides. So I'll go ahead and jump to triglycerides right here, and then we'll go back to compare those. So triglycerides are going to be the main type of lipid that our body uses for energy. And there's a variety of different kinds that we'll go ahead and get into. But the basic structure of triglycerides are going to be made up of one glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acid chains, as we can see here. And so these fatty acid chains are going to be saturated, monosaturated, or polyunsaturated, or can even form rings. And then I will get into the next slide what this means, but I wanted to go ahead and emphasize the similarities between phospholipids and triglycerides. So, they are really similar. They're both types of fats. But again, it's their structure that makes them different. And so basically with the triglycerides, you have a glycerol molecule that has 3 fatty acids attached to them, whereas the phospholipids are going to have 2 fatty acids, and instead of having that 3rd fatty acid chain, it's going to be replaced by a phosphate head that's going to be composed of just the phosphate attached to the glycerol. So we have to look at the different kinds of fats that can exist in our diet. And the 2 main kinds that we usually associate, at least on the back of food labels, are going to be saturated and unsaturated fats. And so saturated fats are going to be those that are saturated with hydrogen. And I'll show you some examples of those when I'm highlighting each respective one. Whereas the unsaturated fats, those are the ones that are going to have double bonds between some of their carbons. And because they have double bonds between them, that's going to make them unsaturated with hydrogen. So that's what makes them unsaturated, because they have less hydrogens than saturated fats, which are saturated with hydrogens. Unsaturated fats are, when people talk about them, they're mainly supposed to be good for us. But there are some synthetic ones that are really bad for us, called trans fats, that we see on the back of all of our food labels. And if it says 0 trans fat, then that's a good thing. So we'll go ahead and talk about each one of these to, give its own emphasis. So as I mentioned, saturated fats are going to be a type of lipid that have no double bond between their hydrogen/carbon chains. And so when we look at this triglyceride here, we see that when we highlight the carbons, we see that all the carbons have hydrogens attached to them. And they're basically going to be these long fatty acid chains. And because there are no double bonds between any of these, they're going to be saturated with the hydrogens. And so that's where the saturated or saturation comes from. And so some key characteristics of saturated fats are going to be they, contain all their hydrogen places are filled within the carbons. And so they all have only single bonds between every carbon. And because of that, they're going to be a long, straight shape. And because of the straight shape, they can basically lay on top of each other quite easily. And because of that, they're solid at room temperature typically. And you're going to find these kinds of fats usually from animals or animal products such as cheese. And these tend to be pretty unhealthy for you, just because when we're absorbing some of this, there's just a lot of fat that comes from these products that is too much for the body to be able to absorb. And I'll talk about what happens when our body's not able to actually absorb all of that. The other main class of dietary fats are the unsaturated fats. And so the unsaturated fats are the ones that have at least one double bond between their carbons. So here I have an example of what a double bond looks like. Basically, you have two carbons that are attached to each other. And because you have these two carbons attached to each other with a double bond, that means that there's two less hydrogens attached to them, making them unsaturated. So if the unsaturated fat only has one carbon double bond, then it's called monounsaturated. If it has two or more, just how we see here where there's four, it's going to be polyunsaturated, or poly meaning many. Again, most of the time, unsaturated fats are healthy, like the ones I have listed here. But then you're going to have some that are not good for you, called trans fats. So characteristics of unsaturated fats, these are going to be both the good and bad kind. So they usually contain less than the maximum number of hydrogens, and that's because of this double bond that is facilitated between the two carbons. So notice how, because this double bond is here, there are two less hydrogens, as if you were to compare it with the saturated example. Because they have this double bond in front of them, or within them, they end up forming these kinks in them. And so it's harder for the fat molecules to actually sit on top of each other instead of the saturated fats, which are just completely straight. These kinks basically make it harder for the fats to sit on top of each other. And so because of that, they typically are liquid at room temperature. So, they're usually going to be oils. They're usually derived from plant products, as plants also have fatty acid storages within them to facilitate energy. And typically unsaturated fats are healthy, but again, not the trans fats. So when we're talking about the healthy unsaturated fats, we need to, emphasize that we need these in our diet. They're very good for us. So most of the time, our body is able to synthesize fats, but there are times where we don't have the right enzymes to be able to synthesize the fatty acids. And so anytime our body can't process something or synthesize something, it's considered essential. So here I have the two main essential fatty acids that our body needs. And so the main one that is really good for you are going to be the omega-3 fatty acids. And the omega-3 fatty acids have been shown to reduce your risk of heart disease. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but the main one has to do with omega-3 structure itself. Acts as a precursor to anti-inflammatory molecules. And so if you're consuming more omega-3s, then you're going to shift your physiological state more to an anti-inflammatory one. Whereas diets that are high in omega-6 fatty acids tend to shift the physiological state to more of a pro-inflammatory one, because it is not balanced with omega-3s. And that imbalance is going to lead to heart disease. And so omega-6s, they can play a role in both anti and pro-inflammatory. Oops, I have a typo here. But omega-6 precursors are for pro-inflammatory molecules. And again, it's not always, but it has to do with the ratio. So the recommended ratio that we should be getting in our diet should be, for every one omega-3, we should be consuming 1 to 4 omega-6 molecules. However, with our typical Western diet, for every 1 omega-3 we're consuming 14 to 25 omega-6s, which is, really tipping our physiological state to a pro-inflammatory one, which is not good for our bodies. Foods that are going to be really rich in omega-3s are going to be mainly fish. That's what people associate it with. Chicken, eggs, peanuts, and beans. And then one that I should have included on here are chia seeds. Chia seeds, if you look at them per gram compared to fish, they have more omega-3 fatty acids. So eat your chia seeds. Now let's talk about the bad or unhealthy unsaturated fats. So typically these are going to also have, a double bond formed in them, but when they do this, it's an artificial process. It's not natural like these unsaturated fats that are found in like fish or vegetable oil. Basically, what companies will do is they'll hydrogenate the some of these fats. And basically what ends up happening is it ends up changing the structure of itself of the fat. And the whole point of hydrogenating some of these foods is to increase the shelf life of the processed foods. And so, more processed the things are, the worse they are for our body. And trans fats are associated with clogging our arteries. And so a lot of deep fried fast foods or desserts are going to be prime examples of foods that have trans fats. So that's why you really want to stay away from these, because they have so many trans fats that are really going to end up clogging your arteries and leading to cardiovascular disease. Here I have a list of dietary sources for each of the main dietary fatty acids. So again, your trans fats are going to come from all of these delicious bad foods for you. And this is one of the reasons why they're so bad for you. Your saturated fats are mainly going to come from your animal products. And the unsaturated fats, at least the good ones, are going to come from mainly oils from vegetables, and the other one of fish. So people are always scrutinizing cholesterol, and I think it's always some kind of fat. It's always, if it's not fat, if it's not sugar, then it's cholesterol. So cholesterol differs from the other fatty acids in that it has rings instead of a long tail instead. And so a typical cholesterol molecule will have these 4 rings present. And so again, the cholesterol plays a really important role in maintaining the fluidity of animal cell membrane. And so there's going to be your cell membranes that are going to be studded with these cholesterol molecules. It's important to also note that animal cells use cholesterol to synthesize really important lipid-derived hormones. And so the 2 main ones that you're really going to associate with cholesterol or steroids are going to be the sex steroids, which, I have 2 listed here: progesterone, and you also have testosterone and estrogen. But then you also have stress hormones such as glucocorticoids. And so all of these need this cholesterol precursor in order to form this. Cholesterol is produced by our body in the liver, but we also uptake it through consumption of food. So why does your doctor say you have high cholesterol? What does he even mean by that? Well, what he's referring to are the molecules that carry the cholesterol in your blood. And these molecules are called lipoprotein. And there's a few different kinds, but the ones I really want you to focus on are these low density lipoproteins and these high density lipoproteins. And so here I have a nice diagram that basically shows you the composition of each one of these types of lipoproteins. And so when we look at the low density lipoproteins, these are going to be really high in cholesterol. So if we look at all of these types of lipoproteins that exist, they have a high composition of cholesterol in them. And so this particular lipoprotein, what it basically does is once your fats make it into your body, this type of lipoprotein is going to basically deliver cholesterol that you consumed to different parts of the body. And again, one of the main things that your body needs is for the cell membrane. And so every cell in your body has a cell membrane, so it requires cholesterol. But of course, it's a fine balance. If you ever have an excess amount of fat or cholesterol in the body, what you have is this good cholesterol, this high density lipoprotein. And the reason why they're so good for you is because if you look at their composition, they're mainly made out of protein. And the reason their main function is really to pick up any excessive cholesterol that's floating in the blood. So once this LDL shuttles all the cholesterol it needs to in the body, the HDL is going to go and circulate and try to scavenge or pick up any of the unused cholesterol so it doesn't harm the body. But it's, again, a fine balance. You need to have, you really want to have high density lipoproteins in your blood. If you don't, it's going to create a lot of problems. So let's talk about how we metabolize these these lipids. So typically when we're talking about lipid metabolism, we're talking about the breakdown of triglycerides. And so, I mentioned a few different classes of lipids, but when it comes to metabolism, it's triglycerides that we're breaking down to use for energy, as these are going to be the ones that have those fatty acid tails attached to them that we really want. The metabolism of triglycerides comes from three main sources. It's going to be mainly from our foods that we eat, but it's also going to be from our fat storages. And so whenever we're eating fat and it's not being used, we're going to end up storing it into our adipose or fat tissue. Once we need these fat storages, they basically can get broken down, or what's called lipolysis, breakdown of fat, and that will be used for energy. The other main section that is used for metabolism is our liver. And so what ends up happening is, and I mentioned this in the carbohydrate lecture, when we intake carbohydrates, any excessive carbohydrate, you're going to end up storing as glycogen as your reserve. But once you don't need any more glycogen present, you're going to end up basically converting that excessive sugar to fat, and it's going to get shuttled to your adipose tissue. And it's not until your body says, I need fat or I need energy, it's going to break down some of this fat, but it's going to break down the sugar first before it starts to break down any of this fat. So the lipids are going to be digested in two steps. And so the first step is going to be through bile secretion. So bile is going to be released from your gallbladder. And so this is so your big fat molecules basically get broken up into these smaller fat droplets. And so think of bile as like a detergent or a soapy detergent. It's going to help, facilitate the hydrophobic and hydrophilic interactions between all the molecules that are present. After the bile is secreted, you're going to basically have your enzyme that facilitates the breakdown of these fat droplets called lipase. And so the lipase is going to break down the triglycerides basically into its different, constituents. So you're going to have the monoglycerides, the free fatty acids, and glycerol. When it's in these simple forms, what's going to end up happening is, because you still have hydrophobic molecules present, these hydrophobic molecules are going to form these micelles. They're just like these little balls of fat. And so because they're just mainly fatty acids and they're so tiny, your body is able to easily absorb this through the intestinal cells called enterocytes. And so once they're absorbed, then they can go ahead and get sent and shuttled into the blood. And then basically, all of these macromolecules that I've talked about in these past lectures, there's a connection between all of them, and that is sugar. Your body, and I've emphasized this multiple times, runs on sugar. This is what we need, but of course it's a fine balance. We don't want to have an excessive amount. And so, of course, don't memorize this, but I want you to be aware of the amount of metabolic processes that basically can convert into this glycolytic or glucose breakdown to be used for energy. So we have many forms of the protein amino acid pathway that can basically become derivatives used for the production of energy through the sugar pathway. And the same thing with fatty acid breakdown, where that's known as beta oxidation. And so, each of these are going to have their own respective amounts of energy they're going to produce. With fatty acids, again, they hold a lot more energy than protein and glucose. So when they basically get broken down, they're going to be able to produce a whole lot more energy than these two. So what ends up happening when you have too much fat in your body? So what ends up happening is you end up getting diagnosed with something called hyperlipidemia. And so, might sound like a big word, but it's not. Just go ahead and break it down. Hyper meaning too many, lipid meaning fat, and emia meaning in the blood. So you have too many lipids in the blood. And this has to do with, consuming a lot of fats in your diet. And so there's two main fats that doctors will refer to when they're talking about hyperlipidemia. The first one, again, are going to be the triglycerides, which we use for energy. And so too much triglycerides in the blood is just, another fancy word, hypertriglyceridemia, glyceridemia. And then you have cholesterol, which I didn't mention it has a role in synthesizing vitamin D, but the ones I mentioned already plays a role in hormone synthesis and is the main composition of your cell membrane. And so too much cholesterol in your blood, it's going to be hypercholesterolemia. And so when you're looking at your lipid panel that you might get back from a doctor's office, these are going to be the things you typically will see. So they're going to have your total cholesterol, and you want that to be, depends on what doctor office you go to, but in general, you want this number to be below 200 milligrams per deciliter. If it's going to be above that, then, you're going to have some issues. Then you also want to take in consideration your lipoproteins that are present. So again, your LDL is going to be your bad, and you really want this to be less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. Whereas your HDL, your good cholesterol, you want this to be greater than 40. If you can have it above 40 by like a bunch, that you're probably never going to develop cardiovascular disease, because that means you have a lot of this lipoprotein going and scavenging extra fat that's free floating in your blood. And then the other thing you want to be aware of is all the amount of fat that you actually have free floating in your blood, so your triglycerides. And so you really want this to be less than 150 milligrams per deciliter. And so patients that typically have hyperlipidemia, their numbers are going to be a lot higher than what's expected, and they're going to have their good cholesterol being significantly lower than their typical 40. So whenever you get your lipid panel, be aware of these numbers, and what you really want to consider is changing some of these numbers. And so there are medications that you can take if it's severe enough, which I'm not going to get into because I'd rather focus on a holistic approach, because you guys are all young, and you should be able to basically do these two things to help reduce your numbers or increase your good cholesterol. So the basic, but they always tell us, your diet and exercise. So you want to increase your lean proteins, such as your chickens and your salmon. You're going to want to increase your fruits and vegetable intake, which are going to have your, the fiber and whatnot. So it's going to help you feel full faster, so you're not eating so many fats. You want to really decrease your fatty food intake, especially the ones that are sources from saturated and trans fats. And I already mentioned why that is. And then what you really want to focus on is raising that good cholesterol. And the best way you're going to do that is by consuming things that are high in all of that good cholesterol, such as fish, nuts, and vegetable oils. In order to help facilitate this process, you also want to control your weight by exercising. So most of the time, these people that have hyperlipidemia, they're usually obese, and it's because of their diet. And so if you're able to exercise, there's studies that have shown that you're actually able to reduce your bad cholesterol and increase your good cholesterol, but they're not really sure why this is. They just measured participants from exercise studies and measure the amount of good versus bad after X amount of time, and we're shown that the good increased while the bad lipoproteins decreased. Now, what happens if you don't get this under control? Well, it's going to end up leading to cardiovascular disease. And cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer in the world, you know, in previous years before COVID. Once COVID is, a thing of the past, or rather, we have it under control, cardiovascular disease is going to be the same thing. So cardiovascular diseases are really a group of diseases that are going to affect the heart and blood vessels. And so it's estimated that almost 18 million people in 2019 died from cardiovascular related diseases. And so of all the reasons why people die in the world, this accounts for 32% of all global deaths. So that's 1 in every 3 people that died from cardiovascular disease. That's quite a bit. And then when you actually look at the proportion of those deaths, the majority of them were due to heart attack and stroke, which I'll go ahead and talk about what those are. Most cardiovascular diseases can be prevented, but they're all associated with addressing your behavior. And so the majority of the causes for this is really going to be an unhealthy diet, which is going to lead to obesity. But studies have shown that tobacco use is also going to promote cardiovascular disease. And that's because it's going to promote the buildup of plaques, which I'll explain in the next slide. And then the other, main behavioral risk factor is a sedentary lifestyle. So if you're not actually getting active and you're eating all of this bad food for you, none of it's going to get processed. It's just going to get stored, and anything that's in excess is just going to remain in the blood. So, it's really important to get your numbers checked for like the previous ones for your hyperlipidemia or your lipid panels, to detect cardiovascular earlier, because you can actually, prevent this from even manifesting if you do it young enough. And that's why, I'm making some of these lectures with an emphasis on some of these diseases, because if we're going to reduce these diseases, we have to get educated on how they are. And we all know how a lot of these diseases manifest, but I'm hoping that by me presenting some of this information to you, you won't be one of those, the next statistic. So cardiovascular disease really manifests because of atherosclerosis. And so atherosclerosis is basically this fatty material, basically the bad cholesterol, sticking to the side of your walls of your arteries. And so once it sticks to these arteries, with progression over time, they're going to get thicker and thicker. And this is all going to happen within your blood vessels, and your blood vessels carry they carry oxygen to your body. So you need oxygen to live. And so if you have very poor circulation, you're not getting a lot of oxygen to yourself. And so, your body tries to do its best to protect itself. And one way it does is by sending out this specialized kind of macrophage, which again, from the innate immunity lecture, macrophages act as the garbage collectors of the immune system. They're going to be basically differentiated or transformed into these specialized cells called foam cells. And the whole point of foam cells is to try to eat all of this fatty deposit so it's not building up. But what ends up happening is you have your macrophages trying to clean up this mess, but then they keep on having more messes, build on top and getting stuck to these plaques. What ends up happening is these foam cells end up actually getting stuck under the plaque. And that just, makes it worse, because you have basically dying cells that are present. And so that is that's something that you want. Once the plaque has become so severe that it stops blood flow, or it slows it down, once a blood clot comes through that artery, the blood's not going to be able to push through anymore. And arteries are basically the biggest kinds of blood vessels that you have in your body. And so what ends up happening is the main area that it affects a lot of these people that leads to heart attack is the artery that leads into the heart. So basically that has all that oxygen rich blood. And so when you have these plaques that become so thick and then you have a blood clot that flows through, it blocks that blood from going through. Well, if your cells aren't getting the blood that it needs, which has all the nutrients and oxygen, it's going to start to die. And once that tissue starts to die, it's not going to come back. And it's going to end up leading to a heart attack. And so a lot of people, you'll hear the symptoms they end up experiencing are usually going to be chest pain, because they're having this whole blockage and that pressure buildup. They're going to have shortness of breath because they're not able to get oxygen spread out through their body. And because this is all, in the chest cavity, they're going to have a lot of pain and discomfort in their jaw, neck, arm, or shoulder. If this is not treated immediately, this will end up resulting in death. And so what doctors end up doing is basically having to build something called a stent and helping to shuttle the blood so the rest of the heart actually gets sufficient supply of nutrients. Now, so that's a heart attack. So what happens when you block blood going to your brain? Well, that's where you're going to end up developing a stroke. So it's basically the same process, but it's the blood vessels going into your brain, or actually at your brain, that are going to lead to a stroke. And so this is just going to be a blockage of blood to a specific area to the brain. And depending on what blockage it is, because you have a lot, your brain's highly vascularized, meaning it has a lot of different blood vessels supplying nutrients to the whole brain. And so if you have a blockage of one of the main arteries, basically you can go ahead and kill off a whole region. And every single region in the brain has a specific function. And so if you have blood that is inhibited from going to your cerebellum, so the back of your head, then that's going to result in issues with your balance. If you have blood that's getting deprived of regions that control your vision, you're either going to go blind or your vision's going to get blurred. In this region of the brain, you have your motor function of your face and arms. And so what ends up happening if you end up getting deprived of blood in this region on either one of the sides, then you're going to end up having issues with motor function of your face or arms. So that's why sometimes people can't actually control half their face or half their arm. And then the left side of the brain is going to be that mainly controls your speech. And so this patient here obviously has a lot of cell death because they're no longer getting blood to this region of the brain. So more than likely they cannot speak anymore. And so time is of the essence when it comes to experiencing stroke symptoms, because you basically want to try to get rid of that blockage as quickly as you can. And there are certain drugs that are on the market that help with breaking up some of those clots. So you reintroduce blood to that region. So the faster you do this, the less severe effects you're going to end up experiencing with a stroke. So last week, somebody asked me to look into L-Carnitine. So I went ahead and did a little bit of reading on this. And so I'm going to go ahead and, give you a quick background, but I have additional reading in the notes section. So people wanted to know, what does it do? And so it's not an amino acid, it's an amino acid derivative. Basically, lysine and methionine basically are able to combine together to make L-Carnitine. And right now, the reason why the student was asking me, because it's right now marketed as a fat burner. And the reason why they think this, or why people are marketing this way, is because of these biochemical pathways that happen within the mitochondria. So, I'm going to emphasize it multiple times. The reason why the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell is because it's able to take in these macromolecules, or their monomers of the macromolecules, and utilize them from energy for some depending on the pathway. And so with L-carnitine, some biochemists have shown that basically once L-carnitine gets shuttled into one region of the mitochondria, it can actually facilitate the import of fatty acids. And so here we have a fatty acid transport that's bringing in fatty acids. And so if you have more fatty acids that are being brought into the mitochondria, then this can facilitate the breakdown of fat or beta oxidation, so it can be used for energy. It is also important to note, in order for this process to work, there's a lot of enzymes that are involved in this whole process. And so these enzymes require they're called cofactors. And basically these cofactors are just molecules that help enzymes function efficiently. And so some of these are going to be vitamin C, some of the vitamin Bs, and iron. So if you are low on any of these, and this process is going to be very inefficient. More studies need to be done in order to demonstrate the clinical benefits of this, but some studies have shown that it does help with some heart disease, because you're being able to uptake some of the fat better. But I do have a couple of articles, links in the notes section. So if you're interested in reading more about this, feel free to do so. That is all I have for you guys. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask me, at any point this week. I'm sure some people aren't going to be able to watch this tonight. So go ahead and, ask me during office hours or during the review session on Thursday. Thank you.